Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Monheim Microphones. Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. They recently released their new royalty microphone, Monheim Microphones' Unparalleled Excellence, monheimmicrophones.com.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com. Hear from the most influential and innovative voices in today's global garden community at the annual Andalusia Garden Symposium. Famed plantsman and garden writer Dan Hinckley, Sissinghurst's head gardener Troy Scott Smith, Welsh seasonal floral designer and author Lucy Hunter, and edible landscape architect and author Stephanie Bittner. Held on Friday, May 3rd at Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. Tickets are on sale now at andalusiapa.org.
This podcast is being recorded on January 26th, 2024. Mr. Al Key has been involved in the green industry for over 30 years as an owner of DeepRoot Green Infrastructure, LLC. Together with his partners, he co-invented the SilvaCell and has received several patents for his inventions, which address trees and stormwater management in the urban setting. He has written for a wide range of publications, including the Journal of Arboriculture and Civil Engineering News. As vice president, he established a representative network nationwide, set up major distributorships, and has been instrumental on projects such as Metropolitan Museum of Art, USTA Billie Jean King Tennis Center, and the MIT Soma Center at Kendall Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mr. Key is a former board member of Trees of New York, a bronze-level sponsor of the American Chestnut Foundation, a forestry committee member of the Wantasquant Trout Club, and an affiliate member of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Al. We're so delighted that you could be with us today.
Oh, well, thanks a lot, Ava. I'm nervous. I don't want to say anything really stupid. So.
Well, then let us toss you a couple of softball questions to get started. Tell us about how you found your way to horticulture and your current work, because we feel like the answers that you give at this point are often a blueprint for younger people coming up as to the trajectory and the careers that they're putting together. So tell us how you got to where you are with your career and where you grew up and your education, and you can run with that as any way you want.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I was drawn to the podcast is the first guy you had on there was Phil Logan. And he and I are both former board presidents of Trees New York. And he started off as a PhD in English, and he describes trees as ents. So I don't have any formal training in arboriculture, horticulture, any of that sort of stuff. I've been a practitioner for 30 years. You know, why do I love trees so much and that kind of stuff? Well, I grew up on Long Island, and where I grew up, it went from sort of, like more remote area with cornfields and potato fields, and then came in during my 20 years of when I was forming as an individual, it became tract housing and vineyards. So my parents bought a ski house up in Vermont, and in my teenage years, I went up there and I worked for a farmer. And a farmer is a loose term. This guy was the town clerk and had a bunch of side gigs that involved beef and hay and trees and maple syrups, that sort of stuff. I cut lawns for him. We also tapped his trees. We also did a firewood business during the summertime. And this is beer money for our students. It was great. I really enjoyed it. And I still enjoy it today. And I live most of the time in Vermont still. That's kind of it. And then I was a businessman. I have an MBA. I have an undergraduate art history major, and I have an MBA. And so I got involved in sales in the computer industry in the 1980s. And my father-in-law, Julian Ray, a serial entrepreneur and inventor, needed a sales guy. And I had all this great sales training. He had bought this company called DeepRoot, which was primarily involved in Southern California selling root barriers and other related products. They needed a sales guy. And so I came in and I had all this sales training. And I wanted to get involved in a company where I could participate in terms of the ownership. And so that's what happened, really. And then I spent, 10 years getting into, selling root barriers, understanding the academics behind it. And frankly, I'll never forget my first ISA meeting in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I think it was 1993. And there were these two people up there, Nina Basic and Jason Grabowski. And they got up there and they started talking about this skeletal soil mix that they're testing, and they packed it up to 95% and grow trees in it. I came out of that lecture and there were 150 people in the lecture room with both Nina and Jason. And I said, I've got to do something like this. I've got to figure out what to do. These root barriers are not the answer. They're a tool, but they're not the answer to our downtowns. Then we embarked on a 10-year education process, which eventually came up to our number one selling product called the SilvaCell. And that's kind of how I got into it all.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the SilvaCell, as a former professor at a major university teaching landscape architecture and horticulture, we talk about the SilvaCell and how important it is for the infrastructure of a city. That infrastructure is critical for helping trees survive the inhospitable conditions of a city.
Yeah, I agree. And, SilvaCells don't grow big trees, right? It's the soil within them that grows big trees, and especially the water used for those trees. If you look at all the work that's been done on how much soil a tree needs to grow, there's this myth out there that it takes 1,000 cubic feet of soil for a large tree to grow. And I do want to address this particular aspect of it because it is a myth. This notion spawned in the 1990s when Jim Urban, by the way, Jim Urban is the nation's leading expert when it comes to trees in the urban environment. And I consider myself a mentee of his, right? I've walked around projects for 15 years with Jim going, no, we can't do it that way. You got to do it this way, testing the soil and that kind of stuff. Anyway, in 1992, Jim took a lot of data from Nina Basic, Tom Perry, and Phil Crowell and amalgamated them all together and came up with a handy-dandy little chart which related tree size to soil volume and highlighted a number on it that was easily multipliable. 1,000 cubic feet was the number. And if you look at the chart itself, that will give you, on average, a 16-inch DBH tree growing 30 feet on center with an overarching canopy. And it's a good tree. It was revolutionary at the time. It was published in all sorts of academic articles, but 16-inch DBH tree, in my mind, and I hope your audience thinks this correctly, thinks this too, is not a big tree. We want to have overarching canopies over the streets of our cities rather than, just a blob here and a blob there. So if you look at the data that Jim used to come up with that chart, one of the foundational articles was from Nina Basic at Cornell again. The number that she came up with was how much soil does it take to grow a big tree was 2 cubic feet for every square foot of crown projection. And so this is out to the drip line and 2 feet deep. And to me, that's just a much better way of looking at it because the area of the soil is going to match the area of the canopy. And this is the main point. The reason why I wanted to join the podcast today was because anybody who wants to implement a 40% canopy strategy for their cities is going to have to also implement a 40% soil strategy. And I think that's missing from a lot of our planning documents and stuff like that. And I think that's really essential that we get there. SilvaCells are a tool in the toolbox that can you use to get there.
Wow, that's a great explanation. I love it. And we love Nina. She's a fabulous person and scientist and lecturer extraordinaire. And I'm sure she's still active in work out there.
Yeah, we bet the farm on her research. Absolutely.
I was just going to say, people in this industry never retire. They just shift over to something else within the context of trees, because you just never give up on trees, right?
I've been to a number of her lectures. I mentioned her before. And also I've been up to Ithaca, and I've been the recipient of her hospitality and her Brooklyn jaywalking. She really is a wonderful academic, and has been incredibly influential. So.
Yeah, it's interesting in that with that last commentary that you gave us, Al, it's those days of being in the lecture hall at an ISA meeting with Nina, Jason, Dr. Kroll. It felt to me like a sea change all of a sudden how we were looking at urban trees. To be honest, I still struggle with that canopy to soil formula. But I know it's doable, and, numbers and percentages aren't always my thing. I'm also, our audience can't see the background that you're using, but we're seeing a very nice LA. It looks like maybe lindens or something, and I trust that's probably SilvaCell installation. So let's talk about, I guess, you're the perfect person to ask in terms of how people are going to say, hey, great product, but our modest urban forestry budget just isn't going to be able to do too much in terms of large scale plantings. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would say that, you have to look at the site first, right? And you have to do evaluation. Oftentimes people think of maximum intervention in our downtowns as the only way to go. Whereas if you look around our cities, there are many locations where the soil is relatively not that bad, right? And the question becomes, where is it really bad? And where is it not that bad? And where is it okay to plant trees in it? And so I would say to people that look for the opportunities for open or free soil, within that content, can we access those? I would also say, look at how many times the thing has been redeveloped, right? So, like if you're in Philadelphia in, Society Hill? No, what's the name of that older neighborhood? The old city, that has only been really redeveloped once since the 1700s, right? And in those tiny little streets and things like that are enormous Islantha and Paulownia and that sort of stuff. And so these are the areas that you don't have to do, dig up the entire street and install soil. You have to go in there and ascertain where these things are going. Those Paulownia and Ilanthus are terrific indicators of where you don't have to spend, $20,000 a tree or that sort of stuff. Right. I guess my advice would be to use your head, use all those skills of arboriculture that you have in your back pocket to a site, and look at the history of the site. If there was a large building put in and they took that out and they put in a mixed use thing, or there was a parking lot, it's been redeveloped 3 or 4 times, the chances are that the soil's been removed and fill was brought in or something like that. That's when you get to say, okay, well, how do we reinvent the wheel here? And the answer is maximum intervention. So.
Right.
Well, it's interesting.
Gotcha.
It's interesting that you look at Old City, because according to conversations with my mom, before she passed away, she said, there were all factories around there. You didn't even know where Independence Hall was, because they had to rip them down to build that area to make it look like something that it is today. And so when you're talking about soil, maybe 2 or 3 times that it's been disturbed, but not nearly as many times as other places within the context of the city. And you're correct about that. One of the things that I think about is looking at picking trees that can actually withstand stress tolerance. There's always a better way to plant a tree by picking the correct species. And if you look at plants that can tolerate maybe more alkaline soils, maybe more compression, and maybe a whole host of things like that, that would be something that you would consider. Is that correct?
Yeah, like most soils can grow great trees if you alleviate the compaction, right? Sandy, silty, clayey, loamy soils all grow great trees if they're not compacted. The nutrient content is fine. I will say that most of our common street tree species are all low-lying. Red maples, things like this are very common, low, and taxodium and bald cypress, this kind of thing. So I did want to sort of steer in the direction to get back to the money question, is that each and every tree is actually a stormwater device in its own right. And if you look at the budgets that are out there these days for tree planting, even under the IRA funding that cities are getting these days, that it's dwarfed by the amount of money that people have for stormwater. So another thing that I wanted to say in the podcast was arborists need to have a seat at the stormwater table with places like Philadelphia Water Department or whatever.
Absolutely. You're right on the money.
I also find that arborists don't know basic terminology about stormwater, things like catchment areas and time of concentration. And they don't know the difference between peak flow reduction and peak flow attenuation. And if they got these buzzwords, they're not complicated to learn. If they got these buzzwords and they could actually address these things, at a meeting with civil engineers and such, it would be good. Right? It's like, you start talking Proctor density with them. It's like, okay, some person knows about Proctor density.
Well, would you also suggest that maybe something like ISA should have a certification in arboriculture for stormwater management? It might be a good certification for people who can speak the speak.
Yeah.
I know we had to learn all that when we were teaching, like the idea of stormwater management within townships. How are they going to be taxed according to how much overflow is going to be coming off of their surfaces and so on. So I think it would be ideal if ISA had something to say about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I never thought about that, but we'll start advocating for that within the profession. Thank you.
It would answer a lot of questions.
Yeah, I remember again with the days of learning about Cornell's structural soil. You mentioned Proctor compaction. I'm rusty with it. Forgive me, Al. But yeah, I agree with Eva. It does raise an excellent challenge because from my perspective, arborists need to remember that they need to always be reaching out to the urban forestry side of their amenity tree, perhaps quite often in the suburban location versus everything that goes into the successful establishment of a tree in the urban environment. And I like the point that you were starting to make there, that tree planting needs to be closely associated with stormwater management, because if you're not doing it right, to a certain extent, I wonder if you're even exacerbating the problem. If you're planting a tree, runoff is resulting because of the installation technique, it's counterproductive. So you just threw 3 or 4 terms as far as the stormwater management component of a tree planting.
Yeah. Well, the unfortunate thing is that small trees don't really do very much for stormwater. But once a tree gets large, the best stormwater tree that you can possibly have would be a 2-foot wide London plane. The leaves themselves are pubescent, and so they actually hold water in the canopy, right? So that's the canopy intercept number. And if you look at work from Greg McPherson, he'll show you that according to his studies in Sacramento, that 2-foot DBH London plane can hold 3/4 of an inch just in the canopy, right? Which is a big event. That's the first flush, the dirtiest of water that comes through. I think the problem is that getting it from a 3-inch caliper tree up to a 2-foot caliper tree is the issue. So we look to the soil that's there in order to provide that immediate benefit for stormwater. So if you have installed, say, 1,000 cubic feet of soil, you can then take that number and treat it as a bioretentive stormwater media, right? And in certain places, like in Minnesota, the state building codes up there, if you give them the soil volume for the trees, you can also take the canopy intercept number and the evapotranspiration numbers for a large tree if you give them the soil. So, there are ways to write code that it benefits the urban forest, even though the trees aren't big initially.
I see.
Yeah, it's the space. It's that whole critical space that's going to absorb the initial runoff.
Yeah. Nandan Shetty in New York City, he worked for the Park Department for 30 years. He's actually did studies that the tree openings themselves capture a lot more rainwater or stormwater than the canopy initially went for after planting. It's just a very small number. But it's one of the few stormwater assets that can improve over time, right? As the tree calipers up, you get an overarching canopy. That's when you really get the benefits.
I think that has to do with pervious paving too. When we talk about pervious paving,
correct.
Here in the city of Philadelphia, we charge for runoff. So if you don't have pervious paving, your taxes go up on water runoff. And if you have a green roof, you have a reduction in your taxes because that takes the initial impact from the storm source and the heavy load that actually helps with. So that whole concept, and it's not just the trees itself, and you're talking about the soil volume, but also the other areas that can be permeable or have green infiltration or water infiltration in a green location. So whether it's a park setting or whether it's a green roof, all of those things add up.
Yeah, they do. And you mentioned green roofs. One thing I love about street trees is that they have a cost advantage over green roofs. Moving all that soil and all that bioretentive capability up on top of a roof someplace is very expensive. So if you look at the cost per gallon treated, street trees are a much more effective way to go. The difficulty with street trees is that they're planted in the public right-of-way, so everybody's got a say in it. Up on a roof, there's one owner, and so green roofs have a jurisdictional advantage, whereas street trees have a cost advantage. So
that's good to know.
So.
Just pulling in our home city of Philadelphia, Al, where it's kind of bootstrap planting, I'll call it, in the neighborhoods, where it's an old city with an old layout in terms of street dimensions, sidewalk dimensions. We're a little constricted. I often mention that I come from Chicago, which has an extensive parkway system. So it's beautiful, Illinois prairie, dark soil in a 8 or 10 foot wide strip on almost every street. Philadelphia's got some challenges there. I wonder if you could talk about SilvaCell and an application, especially in the context of what it does or doesn't do with lifting sidewalks. Will SilvaCell kind of help slow that process down of surface roots lifting sidewalks?
Yeah. Well, the first SilvaCell installation was in 2006 at my sister-in-law's house in Redwood, California.
Okay.
And at the time, Gordon Mann was the urban forester for the city of Redwood City and was there at the installation and stuff like that. We gave my sister-in-law a new driveway, a new sidewalk, and the city signed off of it. We had never installed anyone anywhere. And that first one, right, that we did has no heaving pavement, right? And so I guess my point is that trees are getting quite large in SilvaCells now. The first, really the largest installation that we did was at the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. Those trees are now good 18 inches apart, and they're exhibiting no heaving whatsoever. I will say that we're cognizant of this. So we do have engineering and specifications to make sure that doesn't happen. But if you put a pinup into a 4x4 with lots of soil volume, I think we know what's going to happen 60 years from now, something like that. Yeah,
sure.
Right? So again, I encourage people to use their heads. And just because you're using SilvaCells doesn't mean you throw out all the good rules of thumb when it comes to planting trees in arboriculture and that kind of stuff. Right. So make those things wider, that kind of thing. You mentioned, Philadelphia. We do have a great installation up in Manningham, rather. It's at the Venice Island Recreation Center. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Oh, no, it will. Yes.
It's sitting on a large 100-year tank parking lot where the rec center is, which will take the 100-year storm from Wissahickon Creek coming down into the Schuylkill. And on top of that, there's a parking lot and a planting area that's done by Andrew Pogon, Jose Almanana. And Jose put, the SilvaCells underneath all the sidewalks there, and they're filtering water through the SilvaCells and through these rain gardens before it gets as a pre-treatment, before it gets down to that large tank. So that's actually a really great one. And the trident maples are being used there. So another good low-lying species.
Yeah, one of the best. Do you happen to have any anecdotal information or just a summation on how that went? Because I know that installation quite well. That's actually the neighborhood that I live in. I live in Manningham, Wissahickon.
Oh, great. It's a great place.
Where did the experience come from for the installers? In other words, very technical work there. I knew about the cistern, and I've been down there after heavy rains, and everything is working well. But I'm thinking all of a sudden you've got some pretty sophisticated technology and you're getting local contractors that are doing the work. How are they getting trained to do that? Is that a fair question?
Yeah. Well, contractors, are pretty good, right? So they know how to dig holes and fill them up, and they can do that efficiently. They just don't know the technical aspects of the SilvaCell, say.
Yeah.
They just don't know the nuances that you would have.
Right.
And so at that point, that's the site that we visited to go out, and we walked them through. We attended the pre-cons, this sort of stuff. It's hard for us to do that now when we have scores of projects going in every month. But at that point, we were visiting every single installation, and every single installation does get a pre-construction webinar. So we educate them on how to dig the hole, how deep it's got to be, what is the construction sequence, and we do that religiously for all of our contractors. Now, SilvaCells for large landscapers are getting they know these things right now. And so they have foremen who put a lot of these things in right now. So that technical aspect is being taken care of as the market matures.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was going to ask you about the SilvaCells. Yeah. When you put them over a sidewalk, like when a sidewalk is laid, can those sidewalks breathe up and down so that they float rather than be stationary?
Yeah, I've never heard that question before, but just because you're using SilvaCells doesn't mean it's an unusual sidewalk. It has a standard base on top of it. It's going to be really hard. So, are you talking about freeze thaw? I don't understand.
Like even when we talk about things that are earthquake proof, they actually float on whatever base they're on structurally, so that there's a cushion of movement that they're allowed to make that would keep them sound. And that's what I'm thinking from a structural standpoint. Is there a way to prefab those sidewalks so that they're put in like sides of buildings are prefabbed, where they are actually floating on top of those SilvaCells, and maybe floating is not the exact word, but they're loose enough that they can move with pressure?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that SilvaCells are very durable. They're very hard. They support the heaviest thing on the U.S. highway with about a safety factor of 2. So the fire trucks, big, huge, heavy 18-wheelers, not a problem. In terms of a big earthquake and a fissure happening directly in the cells, they'll be affected just as concrete would. But your comment reminds me of some of the work that Ed Gilman did, and subsequently Jason Grabowski, in that they started to put foam pads underneath the sidewalks to prevent root intrusion.
Right, and that's what I'm thinking.
So the foam gets displaced rather than the concrete. And I thought that's what you reminded me of. So I don't think I have a good answer to your question.
Yeah, and I've seen like the rubber matting that they use for sidewalks rather than concrete. I always think, how could you make something better? That's what I always think, because if something's solid and doesn't move, like how can you make it move and still be solid? That whole idea, the juxtaposition between the two. But that's where my mind goes.
Yeah. How can you make it better? I would say the addition of some sort of porous paving.
Yes.
If we're putting water into these systems, then we've got to have some sort of pre-treat to take the granularity and the velocity out of it. So we can do that within the SilvaCells themselves, or we can add an additional box or whatever into that matrix. So the water would go through the paving, and then it would fill up a box. We make one called the Merino Cell. It's a sister product to the SilvaCell, and then that fills up with water, and then gradually populates the soil for the trees underneath. So there's got to be some way to pre-treat the water before it gets into these systems, so sand and things like that doesn't overtake the soil within these things.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that concept can be made so that it's actually prefabbed and brought in, put over the SilvaCells, so that it actually the sidewalk can go down in minutes, and you're done. You don't have to do any pouring. Everything's complete because it was done ahead of time.
There are contractors who build SilvaCells in their yards and then lift them out, 10 at a time and place them in. And then there are also prefabricated porous pavers, which are like 4x4, 6x6. And then you just lay those straight on top too. The advantage of those things is that they don't have the variability that porous concrete does when pouring, right? So how's it come out of the concrete mixing facility? Every load is different. With these precast, pre-made in the shop pavers, which are 4 feet by 4 feet or whatever, it's all carefully controlled. And so you know what those values are in terms of support, in terms of throughput, that kind of thing. So yeah, there is a movement there to make it more standardized, but I don't think we're there yet.
I think, and the reason why I think that, because I come from a family who were builders and engineers and what have you, but there is a movement right now for houses to be prefabbed in a different way than they were before. That could standardize housing because, it's a custom home. And they were talking about that. And I'm thinking, okay, well, if they could do that with houses, we could do that with sidewalks. We could do that with the SilvaCell structure, have everything all prefabbed. And within a day or two, everything is done because you brought the prefab building on. Everything was done ahead of time and you got it all done. And you don't tie up your central business district for years because you have everything done and it's in. That's where my mindset goes. Maybe that's just too dreamy or something.
Visionary?
Yeah, I don't know. I just think that we do things we sometimes make things harder than what they could be.
Yeah. And I think this is the nature of the public right of way. People want their fiber optic cables. People want their sewer systems. People want their potable water delivery mains. People like their gas service. And so there are all these people who have a stake within that, and it becomes hard for you to implement that without multiple stakeholders. Yeah.
Well, and they're also doing that with houses where the electricians do the electrical work, the plumbers do the plumbing work, and it all gets plugged in. They're all interconnected. And so, that could be done way ahead of time in a factory. Just thinking,
Yeah, sure. Back in 2006, we had to charge an arm and a leg for SilvaCells, right? Because I had 2 projects. But now with, again, scores of projects every month, our prices have come down dramatically. And I think we all want the prices to come down. Quicker, faster, easier is all what we're hoping for. And it has happened.
I think that's fantastic. And of course, the stormwater issue is not going away. What we're seeing in other towns right now, what about the town that withstood the hurricane in Florida? I'm not sure if you saw that whole big article that the guy who came up with the idea of a storm-resistant community came out so successful. There was only a few shingles that came off people's roofs while everything else around them was totally demolished. It was because of the thought process that went into the building of the housing before it ever actually was built.
I got to tell you, trees are a great way to stabilize our downtowns and things like that. But you have to, in terms of wind throw and wind and that kind of stuff. If you look at the IFAS website that from University of Florida, which Ed Gilman set up.
Yeah, I love Ed Gilman's.
There's a whole strategies for designing with hurricanes in mind. So one of the big things that I like is that, we were talking about earlier about 1,000 cubic feet of soil and whether that gives you a big tree or not. To have a wind-stable urban forest, those soil volume amounts are basically doubled from the 1,000, that kind of stuff. It's on the website. I don't know the volumes off my head, but in there, soil volume is only one strategy. Grouping trees together as a windbreak is a good way to do it. The actual roots themselves go out way past where the tree is, so that stabilizes the soil. So when water falls down on it, it doesn't go away. I mean, trees, no matter what it is, trees have an impact. And so protection against wind throw and hurricanes is just one on the list.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Continuing along the conversation, Al, about stormwater management, can you talk a little bit about your newer product here that DeepRoot has for underground water storage?
Oh, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I'm fascinated by it. Tell us the name of it. I'm sorry, it's escaping.
It's called the Merino Cell.
The Merino Cell, right.
And the Merino Cell, SilvaCell is Latin for wood, and marine is, obviously Latin for water. And one of the things we always do is we try to have a conversation in between the civil engineers, the landscape architects, and the arborists when we go into a stormwater application. And there's always a push me, pull you about, well, we want to use the soil for this, or we want to use the soil for that. And the engineer says, well, I need a ponding depth. And a ponding depth is a level of 100% void, either in the cells or within a rain garden that holds, a certain amount of water. And we've been putting that into the SilvaCell itself. And the landscape architects and arborists say, oh, well, wait a second, that's reducing our soil volume. And we're kind of like the debate because we get to sell more cells, as the cells get larger and larger. So we thought that it would be a really good idea to have some sort of void space, which could be separate from the cells. And we came up with this thing called MerinoCell. And what sets it apart from other things currently on the market that do it is the degree of cover that you have to have over it. There's a minimal amount of covered. I don't know if you've ever seen these arched chambers that are out there for stormwater management. They require 2 feet of cover, and they're not supposed to get trees near them. No, we don't want trees anywhere near them.
Right, exactly.
So we've designed this specifically to be used in conjunction with SilvaCell and as a standalone with a minimum of 8 inches of cover over the top. And we like that because the SilvaCells don't go very deep. We think about it in terms of, okay, so how do we make 3 stormwater systems together? It's interesting. And we're just about to get our crush data. We just came out with a product. It's not our geotechnical engineers. And if you had a project for me to work on, I would be forever in your debt. So we have yet to install our first one. So thank you very much for asking about it.
Yeah, well, it's an exciting development. And if people wanted to get an early view of the technical specs, are they available anywhere? Or
yeah,
at least
just go to DeepRoot.com and hit the new MerinoCell.
Oh, of course.
Philadelphia needs that right now. Philadelphia needs that for all the big projects that they're doing in park/residential areas.
Yeah, I was just at the landscape below ground, and there was a guy from, I believe it was Temple University, who was talking about the Philadelphia tree pits. And the original ones that they designed back in, I would say, 2008, 9 kind of thing, it was so oversized for stormwater that there was never enough stormwater for them to fill up. So the trees actually never got to access the water within the chambers that they installed. So again, arborists do need a seat at the table when it comes to designing these things. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's the next tier of certification. Absolutely. Give us an idea of how your company can help transform these low-income communities that have really narrow streets that need that 30% tree cover, 40% tree cover. And how can you work with the city to get that installed?
And actually, you know what, Eva, let me jump in a little bit right before Al answers, because it's something I'm giving a lot of thought to. I'm visualizing a North Philadelphia row house community where, 20, 30 years ago, the standard was to come up with a chop saw and cut a 3x3, a 3 foot by 3 foot pit. That was the beginning and the end and the full extent of setting up your tree planting. And my thought would be, and we've been having this conversation throughout this morning on stormwater management, my thought would be the sidewalk is going to be taken out on a mega scale so that a significant percentage of that square footage on that old row house neighborhood street is going to go, and the new technology and the new systems get installed. In other words, no shortcuts and no parceling it out on a little bit here and a little bit there. It's like, no, because we all know from a contracting standpoint, if you maximize the effort in terms of the jackhammer, the excavator, the right kind of trucks, you can make pretty quick work of lifting out old sidewalk and putting new systems in. So, Al, sorry that I jumped ahead of you, but I felt like I needed to say.
And the old sidewalks are reusable. They can be used for wall making and all kinds of other things. So it's not going to be wasted if we play the cards right.
Well, you guys have opened up a whole Pandora's box of possibilities where I could go with this.
Right.
I'll start with the construction, and then I'll get to, I wanted to give a history lesson, but the construction aspect of it is, I mentioned earlier that first off, in these older neighborhoods, how many iterations of development have there been? Is it a townhouse that was put on farmland, or it was the townhouse then removed and they put it in a strip mall, and then they removed the strip mall and put it in an apartment building. Those soils are toast, right? But if it's the first iteration, chances are you don't have to do a lot of iteration. And again, look to the trees that are around there that are growing, right? So we may not have to do a massive amount of intervention in those areas. One of the biggest issues, and I think you brought up material reuse, Ava, is that what do you do with the stuff when you get rid of it, right? And in New York City, I was sitting in a meeting where there's actually a nonprofit that will actually take it and recondition that stuff for you and put it into fill and that kind of stuff. And in fact, there's an app that people use. Oh, I've got all this fill. Contractors will use. I've got all this fill over here. Does anybody need topsoil, or does anyone need this fill? And there's a whole network of trucks that go around delivering fill from one site that's been excavated to another one over here that's been over there. So the solutions are out there. But we did start in on this whole notion of urban equity and environmental equity, that kind of stuff. And I was basically oblivious to all this sort of stuff before I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, Case for Reparation, in the Atlantic magazine. If your listeners have not read this thing, you go out and read it, because it'll make your blood boil as the mistreatment and the way our downtowns were developed. Really interesting article. He's now, I believe, tenured professor at Howard University or something like that.
He is, yeah.
He's really a great writer. And so I began to think, how did that happen? How did all this, thing happen? And then I went to a seminar with Thomas Woltz in Charlottesville, Virginia. And during the seminar, we were doing a tour of trees in Charlottesville. And Thomas said that if you looked at a soils map of Charlottesville, Virginia, and then overlay with that the poorest communities of color, typically, they would line up exactly with an 85-95% correlation. So people of color, in this time the formerly enslaved, were given by the Freedmen's Bureau the absolute worst soils to live on, the least productive, that kind of stuff. So I translate this into our downtowns, is that our downtowns in these lower neighborhoods have the worst soils of any place you could possibly imagine, right? Except in those places where that hasn't been developed very much. But think projects and mass housing, that kind of thing. These are areas which are totally compacted and the soil was removed. Again, similar to what happened in the 1860s and the 1930s and the 1950s. It's, we need to undo 150 years of soil mismanagement. Again, I go back to the fact that trees occupy the same amount of ground and air, right? It's a 1-to-1 ratio between the canopy and the soil on average. So that's the first thing we can do for our downtowns and create environmental equity. And then we can do all sorts of stuff with the results. We can filter water through it. We can get shading. We can have urban heat island reduction. We have all those benefits that are associated with trees that we all know so well.
That's neat.
There we go.
I love that. You covered a lot, and I think it kind of leads
further.
Yeah, please don't stop. It does make me think, though, that with the money that we are going to be seeing with the infrastructure bill, all of us have been pulling on the same rope, and you have to hope that there's a consciousness and a across-the-board commitment to planting all these trees well, planting them to best practices, assuring that there is a very high percentage of transplant success. And we'll see where it goes. But I worry that, we'll still have wire baskets sticking out of the ground, trees planted too deep, trees planted too high, over mulched, substandard, and these, of course, are things that we can all hope for the best, and every city and municipality is going to handle it differently.
Well, don't you think that even like if you were working with SilvaCells, the ideal thing would be to work with a bare root tree, because when you come in and fill in, everything's the same type of mix, so that you have a universal mix. You don't have all this different type of soil and clay maybe from a nursery because the tree was bald and burlap. But to bring them in bare root, like the structures that they're going to be sitting on, they're all going to work together as one unit, so that when you bring that fill in, you're filling in your whole system, everything works together. And that would be ideal, at least from my perspective. I'm just thinking of what it looks like underneath the ground, where everything is structurally visible, that you can see the roots of the trees and you can see everything before it's filled with your different types of whatever you're using. If you're using a Cornell mix, do you use Cornell mix with your SilvaCells?
Well, we think that Cornell mix is certainly another tool in the toolbox. I'm just going to say it. I'm not a big fan, right?
Okay.
I would love to throw structural soils under the bus, even though I love Nina Basic. And there's been a bunch of research on there that really shows how inefficient it is, right? So it's 80% rock, and the rock does nothing for the trees, but everything for the sidewalk. So people, they routinely place the SilvaCells at 1,000 cubic feet, and they compare that to 1,000 cubic feet of structural soil.
Oh, yeah, no.
That's not it. You have to compare 1,000 cubic feet of SilvaCells to 5,000 cubic feet of structural soil, and to get the same soil volume for the tree. And so if you do that, if you look at the 5,000 CU soil versus the 1,000 SilvaCells, will be half the price. Easy. And I think that's what people miss out on. Now, we have used structural soils in some of our things as a sub base, or people use it to fill in where we can't fit the cells and things like that. I think that all that's fine. And it is a carefully controlled product. It's licensed. There are a lot of good things about that product. But in terms of its efficiency, SilvaCell should blow it out of the water.
So what we should be doing is looking at what we have the most of, say, for example, in this region, mushroom compost, say, for example. I'm just going to use that as an example. And find something else that we have in large supply and make a new soil if we don't have regular soil to work with. Or maybe mix that with regular soil, whatever regular soil is, because I don't think there is a regular soil, and create that mix for that area. So whatever area you're in, you use that thing that you have the most of, whether it's compost or whether it's mushroom compost or whether it's vermiculture or it could be in the South, it could be parts from fish, and you're using all that in making your soils. You're reusing something that needs to be reused, and you're also creating a new use for it and blending it with things from the area rather than bringing things from outside the area.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have specifications for soil reuse. Sorry, my light here is working. We have soil specifications for material reuse and stuff like that. But there are a lot of things within the soil industry which I don't think are particularly interesting. So, or particularly good. And one of the practices that they do is soil screening, right? So soil structure is a fundamental aspect of soil. Clay has good structure, sand has none. But, I know soil mixers that they put everything through a 3/8 screen. It obliterates fundamental property of soil, and it compacts easily. So what do they do to get rid of that compaction or to get rid of that compactive property? They add sand to it. And sand is much less productive in terms of soil for trees and that sort of stuff. There's less organic matter, things like this. So if we could change the soils industry into the material reuse stuff that you're talking about, look at the site. Is the soil there that bad? Can we add some compost to it? Is the organic matter within the soil, 2 or 3% at least? So therefore we can just add some compost to it, fluff it up, and use the stuff that's there. I think the soil industry needs to change. And that's the reason why we like unscreened soils the best. And work by Brian Sharonbach and others have proven that unscreened soils do best for trees. Yeah, let's have that soils discussion.
I think that's critical.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Again, SilvaCells don't grow big trees. That's the soil within them does, and the water that goes into them as well.
Al, we're actually running out of time. I knew this would be one of those conversations where we'd cover a lot, but I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of a platform. I have a feeling you might have one or two talking points that are burning in the back of your mind that we'd like to give you a platform for a few minutes if that would be the case. Are there things you'd like to share with our listening audience, talking points that maybe we didn't cover?
I would say that the science regarding SilvaCells is incontrovertible. SilvaCells is the best way to plant trees in the urban environment. If you can discern, all you run out of the other options. There are various different kinds of structural soils out there, but So I can't, you stumped me.
All right, how about this? How about species? Because we're about to ask you what your favorite tree is, but I have a feeling you've also firsthand been on projects where you've seen trees go in that you really think, wow, this really checks all the boxes in terms of right place, right location.
Rather than choosing the right tree for the right place, I think the paradigm should shift into make the place right for the tree. And so, I'm thinking that, because we're removing compaction and putting, a loamier or more productive soil underneath the sidewalk in these chambers, we can expand the soil palette into the plant palette into different trees. So, we don't have to have just street trees. Maybe we could think about something along the lines of, well, not a beech for a street tree, but maybe for a plaza tree. That would be a good choice.
Or even smaller trees like redbud on those really narrow locations where you can't really grow a really big tree. But if you have really excellent soil, they can reach their full capacity. So something like that would also be great, I think, and give you color at the same time.
It's true. Also, I think people need to take advantage of climate change, right? So you were going to ask me what my favorite tree is, and I was going to request that I get two.
You can have two. You can have three.
I love southern magnolias. They don't call it Magnolia grandiflora for nothing. And when I was growing up in Long Island, they were everywhere. And this is New York, for God's sakes. And people have a feeling that once you get over the Mason-Dixon line or anything north of Baltimore, forget it, right? Which I think is a true travesty. So, things are getting warmer. I know of many examples of southern magnolia as street trees and things like that in New York, but this should be added to all our lists in our downtowns because it's a magnificent tree. There are all sorts of cultivars that are smaller, bigger, whatever. And there is one caveat with this thing, though. If you get an ice storm, then that it can get problematic, right? But those things are happening less and less frequently. So I would say southern magnolia up around in Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, maybe even Chicago would be worth a try, certainly.
It's a beautiful street tree.
As a street tree.
Interesting. Yeah, I love it.
Absolutely, yeah. There's one called Little Gem, which doesn't really get big and might be perfect for your downtowns in these areas. My other favorite tree is, and this is going to be totally different, is the American chestnut. If you've ever seen a grove of American chestnut, the burrs are absolutely gorgeous and the leaves are gorgeous too. And of all trees that are quintessentially American, the American chestnut is that. As you know, the American chestnut was blighted by the Chinese chestnut blight, which came over here in the 1920s through the importation of a tree into the New York Botanic Garden.
Right.
And so now, all the trees that were across the eastern U.S. are all gone. Maybe you can find one or two. And I am a bronze sponsor of the American Chestnut Foundation. They're actually going out and taking the Chinese chestnut and genetically changing it so it is blight resistant. And these trees are all over the place. There's some at UVM, there's Cornell has a few, all of these educational institutions throughout the United States. Down in Virginia, there's a whole bunch. And if you donate money to the American Chestnut Foundation, they will send you a germplasm agreement and a few seeds. And you can actually plant these things and grow them. Because it's a foodstuff and the USDA has not given approval for it, it has to be carefully controlled in the rollout because this has never happened within the industry. As a tree that is good for foodstuffs has never been approved by the USDA. It has to get formal approval before it gets wholly out into the market as well. Blight resistance is a bit of a spectrum, so not everything's 100% resistant to the blight, but they're getting there. And they are beautiful. And gastronomically, they're far superior than any chestnut that's Italian chestnut, Chinese chestnut on the market. American chestnuts are almost halfway between an apricot and a cashew. They really are delicious if you've ever had them.
Boy, that is a great answer.
He has one more, doesn't he?
Do
you have a third one?
Let's see. No, I have a third one, but I've forgotten it.
Okay.
Let's see.
Al, will there be a day where the consumer will be able to purchase, the 1-inch diameter genetically engineered American chestnut? Are we basically waiting for that USDA approval and then it can go out to the marketplace?
The answer is I think you can get them now, but they're not the most wonderful kind of disease resistant. American chestnut. There are only a few trees left that are originals, and those are highly regarded. And those trees have very carefully controlled seeds or fruits.
I see.
And those are carefully pollinated every year. They're looked after like Wagyu beef or something like that. It's incredible. I am not an expert when it comes to this, but, again, the American Chestnut Foundation is trying to reestablish this within our forests. What's also interesting about the American chestnut is that, you know the legend of Johnny Appleseed and how he went across the Ohio Valley and planted apple seeds throughout the Ohio Valley, and the pioneers got all the foodstuffs.
Right.
Actually, it was the American chestnut that fed the pioneers much more so than the apples, though they were very grateful for the apples because of cider. they like to drink cider, yeah.
With the high alcohol content, the apple
Correct.
That was one of the original reasons why he planted them. He planted nurseries before the settlers got there, and then they didn't care what kind of apple it was, as long as they had an apple tree in their yard so that they can make cider. It was potable, something potable to drink.
hard cider.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was hard cider. Yeah. Wow, this has been really exciting to talk with you, Al. And you really gave us a lot of things to mull over. And notice how I used that mull after we talked about apples. And the idea of the equity that can be reinstated into those communities that have been neglected for so long, that need to have that turnaround. And we're really delighted that you invented the SilvaCell. And this is not...
Yeah, well, I was just a member of a team, right? So there are 3 lawyers. My father-in-law, Julian Ray, was a serial entrepreneur and inventor. He's passed away. Also, the CEO of DeepRoot, Graham Ray, was also on the team. Mike James as well. But a critical person was also Jim Urban. Jim Urban came up with the specifications. We left all of our ideas and all of our opinions at the door in our meetings with Jim, and he was instrumental in the initiation of the whole thing. Absolutely. So,
and I have to say that this is not an advertisement for SilvaCell. This is a discussion about a way that we can grow trees in a better way in urban areas.
Correct.
So if anybody's listening to this is not a big service ad.
Yeah. And I would say that I am biased. Absolutely. I love my product and it's great, but I hope that I portrayed this in a way that is impartial.
Right. Exactly. And we thank you for that. Wishing you the very best.
Best of luck, Al.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you very
Bye.
much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.